20 years ago, this conference was born from a simple but powerful belief that those who dedicate their lives to caring for others deserve care too. Today, on this milestone anniversary, we are honored to open with a voice that has spent her career asking one of the most important questions in healthcare. What does it truly mean to show up for another person's suffering? Our keynote speaker, Dr. Nicole Piemonte, holds a PhD in medical humanities and spent over a decade teaching and working with medical students, residents, and faculty physicians. Dr. Piemonte is currently the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Leadership and Associate Professor of Medical Humanities at Creighton University School of Medicine in Phoenix. She has published 2 books with MIT Press, Afflicted, How Vulnerability Can Heal Medical Education and Practice, and Death and Dying. She is also a certified healthcare coach who works one-on-one with clinicians to help them reconnect to meaning and purpose in their work so that they can move forward with intention, both personally and professionally. Dr. Piemonte feels called to helping others express both the pain and the beauty that comes with life in healthcare. And she is committed to helping people find the courage to slow down and look deeper at themselves, at their work, and at their life. On this 20th anniversary, there is no more fitting voice to help us navigate with purpose. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicole Piemonte for her first visit to Canada. Give her a Canadian welcome.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you for welcoming me to Canada. I am a desert girl, but I am having a great time here, so thank you for having me. It truly is an honor to get to be with you this morning. You all do such important work, and to be able to spend some time with you really is an honor for me, so thank you so much for having me. Many of us are probably familiar with Brené Brown. Yes, I see some head nods. Her work inspires me, and I can't think of anyone better to start with a quote for what we're going to do together today. So Brené Brown says, one of the greatest barriers to connection is the cultural importance we place on going it alone. Somehow we've come to equate success with not needing anyone, and many of us are willing to extend a helping hand, that is you in this room, but we're very reluctant to reach out for help when we need it ourselves. She says it's as if we've divided the world into those who offer help and those who need help, and the truth is that we are both. And those of you in this room who identify with being in the helping professions, it's often that you're helping other people, and then recognizing when you need help can be a challenge. And we heard a little bit of that from Bernie this morning. So this is Martha Nussbaum. I love this picture of her. So she is an Aristotelian philosopher, but she writes a lot on compassion. And her work has been really helpful for me when I start to really think about what do we mean by compassion? We use that word all the time, but what do we mean by that? So in her book, Cultivating Humanities, she says, compassion requires a sense of my own vulnerability to misfortune. To respond with compassion, I must be willing to entertain the thought that this suffering person might be me. And this I will be unlikely to do if I'm convinced that I'm above the ordinary lot and no ill can befall me. I see this. So I teach medical students. I teach medical students and residents. And I see this with my medical students. This idea of I'm the professional, they are the patient. They are suffering. I'm here as the healer. And when a medical student or a future doctor, future clinician starts to separate themselves, I am not capable, I'm not going to suffer, I'm not going to die. It is really hard to tap into compassion because you have to be willing to recognize your own vulnerability. And when we look at the Latin root of compassion and what does this really mean, we see that it is made up of the word passion, so the suffering of pain. Here's why you hear that sounds like a strange phrase of like the passion of the Christ, but it's the idea of suffering or enduring pain. And then com, which is in combination or union together. So suffering quite literally means, compassion means suffering pain together. This is not, I feel badly for you, I feel sympathy for you. I feel with you. I can tap into your pain because I can tap into my own pain. And this is why I am called to action. I'm called to respond because I can tap into what it's like to suffer or even face the end of my life. And then I want to care for you out of that feeling. And it's a co-feeling, feeling together. So then what do we mean by compassion fatigue? That's why we're here today, right? So what do we mean by compassion fatigue? Well, if you look in the literature, there's this definition that makes absolute sense. It's this idea of having reduced or limited capacity for compassion because you're exhausted from absorbing the suffering of others. And that is true. Compassion fatigue is real. I think of my colleagues and some of you in this room during COVID, right? Watching people die alone, that's compassion fatigue, where you're just overwhelmed with suffering. And compassion fatigue is different from burnout. We use it interchangeably, but if we look at the research, we see that burnout affects any professional. I guess you could be like a financial planner, and you could be burned out because you're working too much. That's burnout. Compassion fatigue is reserved for many of you in this room who are people in the helping professions who witness the suffering of others. The lawyers in this room who see the suffering of others. That's compassion fatigue. And that's different from being burned out. What can be challenging here is that when we talk about compassion fatigue, it can start to sound like compassion is the problem. From the nursing literature, this is a direct quote. It makes no sense to nurses to participate in programs to foster compassion because they believe being too compassionate is the root cause of their fatigue. Not to mention it's kind of offensive when we say, hey, nurses, doctors, come to this empathy workshop. You don't have enough empathy. It could be a little offensive, but this idea of, I don't want to learn how to be more compassionate, that's what's fatiguing me. So we have to get really clear on our language. Because if compassion's not the problem, then what's going on? Because there is something going on. And that's what Bernie was talking about earlier. If you look at the research, neuroscience indicates that compassion doesn't cause fatigue. Your compassion is a good thing. It doesn't cause fatigue. In fact, compassion, we talked about co-feeling, tapping into the pain of another person, inspires you to act. And this can lead to satisfaction and meaning and purpose. Absolutely. So you feel compassion, you feel inspired to care for someone else, that brings you deep meaning and purpose. In fact, compassion can reduce burnout, okay, improve health outcomes for both clinicians and patients, and it can increase resilience among clinicians. This all sounds great, right? But something is happening. People are fatigued, people are leaving, people are retiring early. So what's going on if compassion isn't the problem? From my view, it's this inability to respond to suffering. So your compassion gets tapped into. And then there's something that gets in the way of being able to care well for that suffering person. And what are those things? Well, first of all, there are things that are just terrible and tragic. I think of my friends and colleagues who are trauma surgeons and just see unimaginable pain and suffering. That can cause compassion fatigue because you can't respond the way that you want to because it's tragic. But worse, I think, and we especially struggle with this in the United States, in our broken, very, very broken healthcare system, right? Is that it is these strained resources, which you all experience, or understaffing, right? Or a misaligned priority between your organization and you as a person. When you cannot act on that compassion, that is what's fatiguing. Jessica DeDecker says, we've been frustrated in our efforts to fully experience this cycle of compassion. It's almost this incomplete compassion. You feel the need to respond, you can't do it. And then that is what causes fatigue. That is what causes, I would say, moral injury. So this little schematic can help us think of this. So you witness suffering and you experience that compassion, and that compassion is good. And then you go, am I able to adequately respond? And when you can, that's the compassionate action. And this connects us with each other, brings meaning and purpose. And if you can't, this is what is causing moral injury, vicarious trauma, empathic distress, something that we've been calling compassion fatigue. But when we use that word in the wrong context, compassion fatigue is real. But when we use it, when we mean our systems are broken, we have to get clear on that. And it can be a misnomer when we use it in that context because it implies that your compassion is dangerous. And you should close yourself off. And you should protect yourself. And you shouldn't feel. And you should shut down because it implies that your compassion is bad, that there is something wrong with you for feeling compassion. And it's almost like, look over here, this is your problem. There's something wrong with you. Don't look over here at our imperfect systems or all of the reasons why you can't respond in the way that you want to. And so rather than saying suffering and pain is what makes you human and you're allowed to feel that, we say there's something wrong with your compassion. Okay? And we don't want to do that because it perpetuates this idea of I have to maintain professional distance from my patients, from my clients. I have to remain distant. Now, there is the case that sometimes I think, again, of my emergency medicine colleagues or my trauma surgeons, they do have to shut down at some moments in order to do the things they need to do. But when that becomes the default, like the medical students, I will tell you, 2 weeks into medical school, they'll say, well, we have to keep our distance from our patients and so that we don't burn out. They hear this narrative before they even start medical school. And when that happens, their default is to be shut down, right? And when they perceive, I have to compartmentalize, I hear that all the time. I have to compartmentalize. I have to protect myself so I don't feel, right? And it has the opposite effect. That is the irony. What's causing burnout? Burnout is when you're engaging with patients like a factory line and you are not connecting and not feeling. That is what will burn you out. Right? And it can actually cause feelings of disconnection, right? Loss of meaning and purpose. And that's what's harming people. And those of us in the room who are patients, or the 100% of us who will become patients, Just a little reminder. We feel that distance. When our clinicians are trying to have this professional compartmentalization, whatever that means, we feel that. It perpetuates this idea that there is no place for human emotion in healthcare. And every single one of you in this room knows that being human means that we witness suffering and we feel something. What I think is so tragic about this is when people start to distance themselves and protect themselves, it prevents the opportunity for what some psychologists describe as post-traumatic growth. Now, many of us are familiar with PTSD. Many of us are too familiar with it. But this idea that we can grow from traumatic experiences is something that we kind of fail to talk about. So, post-traumatic growth is what is described as this positive psychological change that we can experience after the really difficult things in life. And many of this, we know this anecdotally. We know like, wow, I went through a really terrible time, but I grew so much from that. And this does not intend to like silver line our tragedy. That's not what I am trying to say. But that we have an opportunity when there is space to process what we're going through, to grow from this. And what's happening with the medical students that I teach, who eventually become our doctors, is that when we tell them to protect themselves, they don't have opportunity to grow from their own traumatic experiences. And what post-traumatic, this comes from the literature of people who have survived breast cancer. And when they interviewed these people, they said, I wish I never went through that experience. It was terrible. But on the other side of it, I have experienced a deeper ability to relate to other people and their suffering. I appreciate life more. I have more emotional strength than I ever imagined. They might have increased or enhanced spirituality and this recognition of new possibilities for their life. These are the people who had the opportunity to process what they went through. And they're like, I'm a new person. I don't want to go through that again, but I'm a new person. Okay? I love this metaphor of kintsugi, the Japanese art of putting broken pottery back together. I think it really captures what we're talking about with post-traumatic growth. Okay? So I think that the metaphor of taking our brokenness and making something new. This isn't the same pottery it was before. This is a new amalgamation of all the pieces put together. But what's important here is no one's trying to cover up the cracks and pretend it didn't break. In fact, they're highlighting them in gold because the cracks are what can bring beauty. And it can bring deep meaning to our lives. If I can share a personal experience with you that I think captures this. So when I was in college, I was 19. My mother was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer, and I took care of her for 2.5 years before she died. And after she died, and it was her birthday yesterday, so it was fun to kind of celebrate her life. And I think people would look at me at that time. I finished my degree, then I went and got a master's, then I got a PhD. And it looked like I was experiencing post-traumatic growth. I was studying death and dying and suffering and vulnerability in medicine, making sense of my pain. The truth is, I was running from it. The more I could achieve, the more I did not have to feel. It wasn't until I finished my PhD and I came back to Arizona, and a year later, my dad was diagnosed with terminal gastric cancer, and he died a year later. And it wasn't until then, when I was like, I can't do this anymore, that I let myself feel that pain and process that pain. And while I wrote about compassion and I wrote about vulnerability, I couldn't do it until I stopped running and I could feel that pain. And I am so wildly imperfect, but I do feel like I can step into and be present with other people's pain, but I had to be able to feel my own. Yeah. And it can capture a little bit of, I'm not trying to hide that brokenness. I still do sometimes, but I'm not trying to hide it because that is what can bring beauty to our life. The question can become, often when I am talking to groups like this and they say, okay, Nicole, so you're saying you want me to feel more. I cannot possibly do that. I need to have more compassion. So the question is, how do you engage in your work meaningfully and sustainably so that you don't have compassion fatigue and you don't leave the work that you're doing? How do you connect to other people without losing yourself? We struggle with this. Those of us in the helping professions, we struggle with this, the idea of losing yourself in your work. And this is a challenge because I truly believe we are all wounded people. If you are a human being on this earth, you're probably a wounded person. Being alive is hard, and we see a lot of pain and we see a lot of suffering. And some wounds run really deep. And they can lead, oh my gosh, you guys, if I could tell you how often I see this with people in medicine, and in particular, the medical students that I teach, these feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, I'm not worthy. If I go to medical school, I'll feel better about myself. If I go to law school, right? If I go to nursing school, if I do this bigger thing, I'll feel better about myself. Yeah, and then the pain that can come when that doesn't work. So Dr. Anna Lemke, she wrote Dopamine Nation. It's a really great book. It focuses a lot on the US, but why we all kind of become addicted and kind of escaping our pain. She writes something really important. She said, I think it's helpful for patients to know that we are all broken and we all struggle. And being smart and highly educated is not any protection against addiction. Physicians are the same regular people with the same regular problems, but the shame can be more pronounced because you're supposed to be this healer who has it all together. And those of you in this room, in social work or healthcare in any way, you're the healer who has it all together. But we don't. We don't. When I started noticing this trend among the medical students and residents that I work with, I started to wonder, does healthcare or medicine attract a certain kind of person? High achieving, fill in the blank, but is there a certain kind of person? Because achievement helps us feel better for a little while, which is something I learned in my own life, right? I started to kind of refer to this as the idea of like the seduction of achievement, that if I keep achieving, I won't have to feel anything. Or it could be totally unconscious. I just know achievement feels good. And it feels better than really kind of looking at myself. So here is one of my favorite people. He's a Canadian, like you all. Gabor Mate. So you had him at your conference here. He is... This, I can't. He's literally my hero. So I love him. So I came across this video. We're going to play it in just a second. And we're going to get some volume. We're going to start over from the top. Give us 1 second. So I came across this video from Gabor Mate, and I was like, oh, you've said everything I've been stumbling around to try to say, and you did it in like 30 seconds, of course. So he's incredible, and it's okay. Okay, here we go.
That's how I
Let me-
interpreted the world's actions. Now, if you're not wanted, medical school is a great way to make yourself wanted because you're offering something very important to people. And when they're in crisis, they want you all the time. Very addictive because there's a hole inside you where you should be, and you're trying to fill it all the time from what you get from the outside. So it's never enough. So the more you get, the more you want. So therefore, I'm addicted to working. Well, that kills joy. It also makes me absent as a parent to my children and makes me absent as a partner in my marriage. And the world admires it. And the more workaholic a physician I am, the more the world thinks I'm wonderful and the more money I make. I get all this reinforcement for my disconnection from myself. And then you couple that with the fact that I really wanted to help people. It gets so confusing. And the thing is to separate what's genuine in that, which is the desire to be of service and to engage in meaningful activity, and to separate that from the need to feel a hole in myself. This is hard work. And in society, it seduces us into that disconnection and even rewards it.
So we're going to break that down a little bit. But Gabor Mate was born in Hungary and now lives in Canada. But when he was 1 year old, his mother handed him over to a stranger to save him from being taken to a concentration camp. And he says this deep abandonment wound that he has always felt is one of the reasons it drove him to go to medicine and to medical school. He said, I was trying to fill this void, this hole inside of me. And medical school reinforced that over and over. He said, if you're not wanted, medical school is a great way to make yourself wanted because you're offering something very important to people. When they're in crisis, they want you all the time. That might resonate with some people in this room. He says it's very addictive because there's this hole inside you where you should be, and you're trying to fill it all the time from what you get from the outside. So it's never enough. The more you get, the more you want. The more workaholic of a physician I am, the more the world thinks I'm wonderful. I get all this reinforcement from being disconnected from myself. This resonates deeply with me, and maybe with some of you too, of that feeling of I get rewarded from being disconnected from myself. Some folks call this the arrival fallacy. This is the idea that once I reach a specific goal, then I'll finally feel that I matter, that I'll finally be happy, right? But instead of this enduring fulfillment we think we're going to have, we experience fleeting joy followed by a return to baseline. So I coach physicians. Sometimes I kind of say it's like a fake therapist for doctors, but some of the doctors I work with aren't quite ready to see a therapist, but they'll see a coach. Okay, so that's what I do. And then I secretly get them to talk about their feelings, and it's all wonderful. But I hear over and over and over again, why is it? I had this one particular client. She says, Nicole, I graduated medical school and I felt good for about 3 days. Then residency, and I felt good for a couple days after that, and fellowship, and now I'm the division chief of my department. Why does it only feel good for 2 days? Because that lasting, enduring meaning and purpose, she's still searching for. I work with some OBGYN physicians. They're in their mid-30s, and they have said to me, on paper, my life looks perfect. It doesn't feel perfect. What's going on? And I think it's this arrival fallacy or that seduction of achievement and getting kind of stuck in that trap. And so then I ask myself, can we be addicted to helping other people? Now, I read this book, Codependent No More. Many of you might have read this book. It was popular in the 80s. I read it for my own personal life, found it very, very helpful. And Melody Beattie says in passing in this book, people in the helping occupations might struggle with codependency. And I was like, yikes. Okay, yeah, that's true. Okay, people in the helping professions who want to help other people might be struggling with codependency. She says this in particular, people who love, care about, or work with troubled people may be codependent. If compassion has turned into caretaking, if you're taking care of other people and not taking care of yourself, you may be in trouble with codependency. I said, I'm in trouble with codependency. I felt attacked. Yes, because it is easier to focus on rescuing, healing, helping other people than it is to focus on our own pain. Let me tend to your pain. You're suffering. You're in trouble. That's easier than looking at my own stuff. I don't want to look at it. I'm going to keep running and running and running. What is so terrible is the trap that healthcare offers, because medicine, medical training, healthcare, nursing, they reinforce this. They reinforce and capitalize on our desire to help other people. This is from Abraham Verghese, a wonderful novelist and physician, who he writes in his book, The Tennis Partner. Despite all our grand societies, memberships, fellowships, specialty colleges, we are horribly alone. The doctor's world is one where our own feelings, particularly those of pain and hurt, are not easily expressed, even though patients are encouraged to express them. We know that's not necessarily always the case, that patients are encouraged to express them, but particularly there is silence around the caregiver. There's a silent and terrible collusion to cover up pain, to cover up depression. The profession is full of physicians who are more comfortable with their work identity than with real intimacy. I see this over and over and over again, because sacrificing ourselves for work or in our personal lives can feel easier than looking at ourselves. And healthcare is full of invitations to neglect yourself. Every day, all day, there is an invitation to neglect yourself. And when we are checked out of ourselves, that is when fatigue and burnout and moral injury can happen. I like this definition of compassion better. This is from the Internal Family Systems Institute, and they say to be open-heartedly present and appreciative of others and oneself without feeling the urge to fix or change or distance or judge. I am just fully present with you. That's it. And it is hard for those of you in this room who've been trained to fix and help and heal. To just be present can be such a challenge. What I like to remember is that sometimes this desire to fix others is more about myself than it is about the other person, right? And then when we rescue others, we might be disempowering them to help themselves. Now, there are times where you are called to help clients or patients, and you do need to help them. But when you get very attached to the outcome, and if they don't help themselves, then it feels like you're a failure, you might be stepping into that codependent space where the outcome of their lives matters for your life, when really you're going to walking alongside them. When we rescue others, we prevent opportunities for their growth, their post-traumatic growth, right? Allowing them to feel pain. So how can you truly help others without losing sight of yourself? I want to leave you with some real things to do so you don't just feel like I've dismantled everything and left you with nothing. So we are going to talk a little bit about what this can look like. Here's something I need you to hear. You do not need to become more resilient because you are already very resilient. That is why you're here. And the literature actually shows this. So at least for clinicians and physicians, when we look at the US population, they have significantly higher resilience scores. That is what gets you through nursing school, gets you through graduate school, gets you through medical school, is your resilience. So you're fine. You don't need to become more resilient, okay? There are some things we need, but I don't think resilience is one of them. I think clinicians and people in the helping professions need more opportunities for connection to each other, to clients, to patients, to themselves. We've really become disconnected from ourselves. So you don't need more resilience, you need more connection. But we have to intentionally create these opportunities. If you just let your job happen, if you're in healthcare and you just experience the everydayness of healthcare, you will get caught up in the wheels of it and you will be disconnected all day, every day. So we have to intentionally create it. Now, this might be fairly controversial, but I say it every moment I can, is that patient-centered care is so important. But I think it's time to shift a little bit away from patient-centered care. Now, patient-centered care was really important, that it helped us swing from like this paternalistic, leave the patient in the dark thing. And now we're over here where we really rely on patient autonomy. But what patient-centered care leaves out is you. So we're going to move from patient-centered care to relationship-centered care. That you matter too, and you have human emotions, and those are something we can have in this space, right? So relationship-centered care, this is actually fairly popular in the 90s, and I'm bringing it back, okay? So it's the practice of medicine. The assumption is that healthcare is inherently interpersonal. We know that. It's an interpersonal process where relationships matter, the patient and the clinician and the family, the patient and the family, the clinician, you and your colleagues, or to yourself. And there are some principles here that personhood matters, that affect and emotion are important. Relationships don't occur in isolation, and maintaining relationships is healing and morally valuable. Number 2, affect and emotion are important. We are not often saying that in healthcare. We do not say that. And I'm reminded, in February, I was giving a talk sort of related to this, and we were talking about relationship-centered care. And afterwards, one of the physicians in the room, she stood up and she said, I have a question. I feel like you're saying you're giving me permission to have emotion. I said, yes, absolutely. And she said, well, I'm carrying around all of this guilt. She's a family medicine doctor, and she said, my patient of 20 years, I had to give her a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, and I knew what that meant. And when I told her, I cried. And I felt so much guilt that I cried. And she said, 8 months later, I went to the hospital and I held her hand while she was dying. And I got to be with her. And she said, should I have cried? Was that wrong? And of course, if a physician is crying so much that you then have to tend to their emotions as a patient, okay, that might be inappropriate. But you're giving a patient a terminal diagnosis and there is nothing you can do. You cannot fix her, you cannot heal her, you can't cure her. So the most healing thing you could do was to feel with her. What a gift that you gave her. And then you were there holding her hand at the end, like you are a true healer. And yes, you can cry. And so often people in healthcare need to hear that they get to be fully human. This is Rita Sharon. She's a physician who started the narrative medicine movement. She says, through authentic engagement with their patients, physicians can cultivate affirmation of human strength, acceptance of human weakness, familiarity with suffering, and a capacity to forgive and be forgiven. And that's what happened with that physician I just told you about, right? And she had to learn what forgiveness looks like and a familiarity with suffering. I can assure you, when we're trying to recruit medical students to our medical school, we're not saying, you're going to learn human suffering and the capacity to forgive and be forgiven. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? I like science and I want to help people. That's why I'm going into medicine. But this is the truth. And when you stay open and receptive to connection, this is what happens. It will change you. It will change you. I want to give you an example of what this looks like in practice. So Schwartz Rounds, the Schwartz Center is named after Ken Schwartz. Some of you might be familiar with Schwartz Rounds. I'm going to tell you about it. It was named after Ken Schwartz, who at the age of 39 was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he was a healthcare attorney. And he was worried, this was in the 90s, And he was very worried that with the rise of like managed care plans and all of these insurance companies, maybe you guys don't have the same issues. Ours are really messed up. He was very concerned that we were losing compassion in medicine because there was all this interference of bureaucracy. And so he had this dying wish because he said, he posted in the Boston Globe, he wrote an article. He said, "It is my caregivers and their compassion that made the unbearable bearable." So his dying wish was to have a center dedicated to compassion. So the Schwartz Center was established at Mass General Hospital in 1997. They started piloting Schwartz rounds, and it's at over 800 sites internationally. And Canada started Schwartz rounds in 2014. Okay. And what this looks like is an opportunity for caregivers to talk about their lived experience caring for patients. What does it feel like? So you're not allowed to like talk about the medical management of the case. You're talking about what it felt like. So we have this at our hospital where I work in Phoenix. This is UCSF because I always forget to take a picture of our Schwartz rounds because I'm up there facilitating it. So that's UCSF. But we get this planning committee together and we find people in our hospital who we think could talk on a particular topic. And the point is to get the people in the audience to start saying, "I'm so glad you said that. I remember when I was caring for this patient," and we start to normalize vulnerability and connection. We do a little, that is us. This was a dress rehearsal. We do a dress rehearsal on Zoom before we get together in the big space at the hospital. And it is this interprofessional team. They tell their stories only for like 3 minutes so that everybody else in the room can participate and share their experiences. And we get people talking about their experience, relationship-centered care, that they matter. So some of our topics we've had, when everything you have is not enough, caring through a pandemic, that's what we did during COVID. The patient I will never forget. The healer as patient, learning firsthand from illness or injury. This is where we had our clinicians, nurses and doctors who became patients at our hospital in the ICU and what it was like to go from healer to the patient in the bed. The power of apology, vulnerability and forgiveness in healthcare. Conversations on colleagues in crisis. This was some of our clinicians talking about when they've had a colleague or a friend die by suicide, and we had one of our emergency medicine physicians talking about his continuous struggle with thoughts of suicide that he struggles with. I mean, we're really trying to normalize vulnerability here. Stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue when connection heals. Do you think I had something to do with the title of that one? I did. Okay, we've got one coming up in 2 weeks where we're talking about the masks we wear when we feel like we have to hide in high stakes situations. And this is the kind of work we're doing. So are Schwartz rounds effective? Yes, there is article after article after article of how effective these are. So 90% of people report better communication with their coworkers, 86% feeling more compassion, 76% reduction of feeling isolated. I always tell people if this was like a randomized controlled trial with some kind of drug, it would be flying off the shelves because this is so effective. And all it is people talking to each other, seeing each other, normalizing that they have emotions. That's all we're doing. And we're giving them lunch, but we are being vulnerable. So I kind of want to end with really the kind of inner work we need to do. So yes, there's collaborative work we need to do, but what is the inner work we need to do? Again, this is Brene Brown, my favorite. She says, we can talk about courage and love and compassion until we sound like a greeting card store. But unless we're willing to have an honest conversation about what gets in the way, and usually it's us, putting these into practice in our daily lives, we will never change, never, ever. And this requires like an honest look at ourselves. So what is getting in the way? Okay. Well, remembering that boundaries aren't necessarily about fewer hours worked. I will work with residents who will say they worked 20 hours a week on some service where they just felt like they weren't connecting to anyone and they felt so burned out. And then they'll do 90 hours that week on a really intense service, but they felt connected and that they mattered. And they're like, I didn't feel burnout. I felt energized working 90 hours a week. Okay, they don't need to become more resilient. See, this is what I mean. They're very resilient. So remember that boundaries, and we'll talk about what boundaries are, but boundaries aren't about fewer hours worked. It's about honoring yourself. It's about not people pleasing. It's holding on to you. It's recognizing when you're rescuing, right? And when you're rescuing for yourself so that you feel better, that's what boundaries are. Not hiding, not disconnecting, and not trying to work. I mean, fewer hours are sometimes better. Sometimes we really do need fewer hours worked. Okay, so to become curious about your patterns, what are your patterns? What do you find yourself doing over and over and over again that's not working? And get really curious about it. Why do I do that? And are you in touch with what you're feeling? Is there space to acknowledge your emotions and what you're feeling? What depletes you? What energizes you? Get curious about that. How do you define success and achievement? Or how has success and achievement defined you? Really wondering about that. How do you know when you're not getting what you need? And when you're just looking at other people's needs? And we can't know what we need unless we look at ourselves, which is the hardest work of all, right? So a little reminder, your growth does not depend on achievement. This, in the West, this is what we think our growth is. Upward achievement. The more we're successful, the more we're growing. Sometimes growth looks like this. It's about depth. It's about reflection. It's about understanding ourselves better and the people around us better. So here's a question for you. I want you to really think about this. If someone you love a lot spent 24 hours in your life, what is the one thing they would want to change? Okay. Is it how much you work? What you tolerate? The way you talk to yourself? Right? The time you spend getting to connect with others? Maybe you have very little time. The reason this question is easier to ask about someone we love, what would someone I love change about my life, is because we are often way more generous to the people we love than we are to ourselves. So I want you to ask yourself that question and hold on to that. So just a reminder, we are built for connection. We are, no matter what. And our compassion is a good thing. And it pushes us to connect with people. So what needs to change in our lives for more connection? That is what will sustain you and energize you. This is the antidote to burnout, is connection to ourselves and to each other. If you're interested in some more of this work, I have that available to you. And I've got more resources. And please reach out. I would love to hear from you. And I think we made it right on time. Thank you so much.